Rag and Bones Shorts, 1941. Written by Juliet Boyd. Narrated by the author. Copyright 2014, Juliet Boyd. Production copyright 2021, Juliet Boyd. (1941) Bones had gotten into the habit of pressing his hands hard against his ears when the bombs were dropped. He couldn't bear the noise. It wasn't the explosions that got to him, even though his brain felt like it was going to burst with the intensity of the sound. The thing that he hated the most was that if he listened close enough, he could hear the screams of the injured and dying. He tried not to, but it was hard to shut out the pain and suffering. It was difficult to comprehend so many explosions and to visualize the number of planes that must have been deployed to create them. The whole situation was insane. He knew the last batch had been very close, because dust and debris rained down on them from the brickwork above. It was a wonder that the sewer hadn't collapsed on top of them, but they'd chosen a site where it was a little deeper, and the strength of the structure had held so far. It wasn't a conscious decision to do something that made him move. It was more of an impulse. 1 second he was standing there with his hands over his ears, water dripping onto him. The next, his hands were grabbing for the metal ladder that led up to the manhole cover, their access to the outside world. It opened out onto an alleyway just off the high street. It was mainly an access road to the backs of shops and industrial properties, not residential. At that time of night, there were unlikely to be people coming out of those buildings to survey the damage. It wasn't exactly safe for him to go out, but it was less dangerous, and he'd got to the point where he was willing to take the risk. He felt Rag grab at his ankles to try to stop him, but his own movements were too quick. He'd pushed the manhole cover off to the side and was already hauling his body out into the cold night air. The air that smelled of burning, and where every intake of it was tainted with the heavy dust of crumbled buildings. He coughed. His lungs weren't used to it. He pulled an old scarf out of his pocket and wrapped it around his face. It wouldn't filter out everything, but it would help with the worst of it. It would also hide his face, which could only be a good thing. "What are you doing?" He turned back to see Rag's head peering out of the manhole. "What do you think I'm doing? A bomb landed close by. I'm going to help." He really thought, from the expression on Rag's face, that he was going to laugh, but he didn't. He shook his head as a mark of despair and disappeared back down the hole, pulling the metal cover closed behind him. Bones walked to the end of the alleyway and turned onto the high street. He wasn't in the least bit prepared for the sight in front of him. It was the first time he'd seen the impact of an exploded bomb in anything but a photograph or on a newsreel. Straight ahead of him, less than 100 yards away, was a large crater. Fire, smoke, dust, screaming. They all mingled together into an atmosphere laden with desperation. Bones tried to remember what had been there before. A baker's on the corner, he was sure, and other shops next to it, all with flats over the top. Behind that, a residential street with terraced houses crammed in next to each other. Yes, small houses for workers. It must have taken out 3, maybe 4 shops, and 10 houses or more. If people had been in those houses and flats, and hadn't managed to get to the shelters in time, there would be a lot of victims. There were already more people around than he'd expected to see. Most were rushing towards the site to see what they could do. Some were walking away, blood spattered across their clothes, dazed and lacking focus to their movement, being helped by some kindly soul that they probably didn't know. Yet others were standing stock still, like him, so stunned by the sight that they couldn't move. But he hadn't come above ground just so that he could look. He walked towards the crater. He had no idea what he was going to do or how. He knew he needed to do something. The sound of desperate voices was deafening in his ears, but this time he was determined that he wasn't going to shut it off. So many people were moaning and groaning beneath the rubble that it took a lot of effort to distinguish one from another. He only managed to pinpoint 5 in his first pass. Other people were standing around the perimeter of the blast as if they didn't know where to start or what to do. They needed someone to lead them. That was the moment in which he knew exactly what he could do. Direct people to the survivors. However, he needed to make the discovery seem random. He jumped down into the crater and began to pull lumps of brick and tiles away from where he knew the first victim lay. The sobbing sounded like a very young girl. He knew if they could rescue her, it would spur everyone on to work hard. He forced himself to strain at lifting rubble. It pained him to do so. He'd only been working at uncovering the girl for a few moments, it seemed, when an official-looking man in uniform, wearing a helmet with a large W on the front, leaned over towards him and started shouting. Bones saw the warden out of the corner of his eye, but pretended not to be able to hear. That had always been his plan if someone saw him up close during the war. It would be his reason for not having been conscripted into the army. If he could prove that he had bad hearing, they wouldn't question him. He continued working until the man tapped his shoulder and then jumped at the contact. "Son, there could be an unexploded bomb in there. It might be best to leave it to the experts." "What?" He pointed to his ear. The man enunciated slowly. "Leave it to the experts." Bones turned back and pointed to the trembling child's half-uncovered foot. "No, I'm carrying on," he said. "Oh, Lordy," the warden said, and jumped down to help him. In less than a minute the girl was being carried away from the site to safety, and Bones was already beginning to uncover the next victim. Before he knew it, other men had jumped in to help, most of them much older than his visible age, and much less able to lift the heavy lumps of debris. He flitted about, trying to assist them with the worst of it, still desperately trying not to show that he could lift any piece, no matter how big, with relative ease. It took 2 hours before they'd recovered everyone who was living, and by that time there was a fire hose aimed at the flames that were still burning towards the back of the crater. At least that's what Bones thought until, as he was dusting himself down, he heard the faintest of cries. Most everyone else had walked away, apart from the warden guarding the site. For a second, Bones panicked. He couldn't say that he'd heard the cry, because that would blow his cover, and likely raise eyebrows even higher as the cry was below the hearing threshold of everyone there. But he couldn't leave the man to die. Bones took a deep breath and tapped the warden's shoulder. "Look, I know you're going to think I'm crazy, but I have this feeling that there's someone trapped over there, right in the corner. I thought I saw something move." To his surprise, the warden jumped down into the crater immediately.
Well, son, your instincts have been 100% so far. I have no reason to doubt you now.
The debris above the trapped man was really thick and heavy. It looked like a chimney had come down in great chunks on top of the collapsed wall. Bones strained and pushed to get most of it moved, being careful not to let his fellow rescuer anywhere near the pieces to know just how heavy they were. It was amazing that the man was still alive. A single metal bar had saved him, holding the debris away from his body and leaving a small pocket of air around him. The look of relief on his face was worth the time it had taken to find him, and the risk to himself. The man had trouble standing unaided, not because of any injuries, but because his body was trembling so much from the fear of being trapped. He shook both their hands hard and long. He wasn't elderly, probably late 30s, early 40s, and he looked fairly fit and healthy. So, even though he was in shock, he would probably recover well from his unfortunate experience.
Thank you, thank you. Please tell me your names. I want to be able to tell my grandchildren about you. I can't do that without your names, he said when he finally calmed down.
Bones hesitated for a moment. It was a perfectly reasonable request given the situation, and he didn't feel he could refuse. He knew that his nickname would sound odd and require a lot of unnecessary explanation, but he didn't really want to use his true name. He didn't have any paperwork to prove his identity either way, but he had to say something, or the man he'd just helped to rescue would never let go of his hand. In the end, he blurted it out. "Alfred Crouch," he said. Well, there it was, done. Now his name would go down in history, at least in some little way. As long as no one tried to delve into his past, that wouldn't be a problem. "I'm Eddie Baldwin. I work on the railways," the man said in return. "Makes a man tough, that kind of work. Guess it saved me. Did my friends get out?" Bones shrugged. "I don't know. We got a fair number of people out, but they've all gone off now. You might find them in the hospital or the shelter."
"I'm George Dell," the warden said. "If you're looking for people, there's also a hall down the road that's been set up to help the casualties. You might want to try there for your friends. And you should get yourself checked over. They do have a doctor there."
"Thank you, I will." Even after the introductions, it seemed like a long time before the man let both of them go. Long enough to make Bones nervous. He looked up to the sky. There was the hint of sunrise in the distance. He couldn't risk staying topside any longer. "It's been good meeting you," he said, first to Eddie, who headed off to the hall, and then to George Dell. "But I should be going now."
"Yes, time for work soon. Be safe, son."
"I will." Bones avoided going down the alley until he was sure that no one was looking, and then he almost dived down the hole. It was odd, but he hadn't felt so alive in a long time. "It was amazing," Bones said.
"You told them your name?"
Rag had almost given up hope of Bones returning. He'd been gone so long. The bombing had stopped soon after he'd left their hideout, but there were many more dangers to a war-torn city than bombs. Bones shrugged. Who's going to check? The whole superhero saving people thing was bad enough, but giving out his real name to a stranger? It had to be the fumes. They'd got into his brain and completely screwed with his sensible button. Bones was usually far too level-headed for that kind of thing. He was the one who always said you can't let people know who you really are, because if they check, and some will, they're not going to be able to find a birth certificate in your name. At least, not one that makes sense to them. And yet, the first chance he'd really had to use his own advice, and he'd ignored it. Do as I say and not as I do. It wasn't an attitude he liked. It was usually only spouted at children. He tried to ignore the implication.
"So I suppose we're going to have to move again," he said,
the resignation in his voice echoing back from the stark sewer walls. Why would we do that?
Because we don't want you to bump into these people again. They've seen your face. Next thing you know, they'll be inviting you round for dinner.
That's about as likely as... It's a war, Rag. They'll have forgotten about me in a couple of days and no one has enough food to invite people round, especially people without a ration book. There are too many other things to worry about. No, he wasn't buying it. It was like Bones wanted to be discovered. Something was definitely messing with his brain. Rag decided it was time to assert himself. This wasn't just about Bones, because his safety was at risk too.
"No, this time I'm taking the decisions. We're moving away from this area and we're doing it today."
He knew from the expression on Bones' face that his attempt at being masterful hadn't worked. "No, we're not. Or rather, I'm not. You go if you want to. I'm staying put. I hate not having anywhere proper to live. I hate moving. I hate the sewers, but at least it's a constant." Constant? Well, that was one word for it. Eddie Baldwin stood across the other side of the high street, his back against the cracked front window of the grocer's shop, and a nearly depleted cigarette hanging from the corner of his mouth. His legs still ached, but the doctor had confirmed nothing was broken. A little bruising never did anyone any harm. "Damn bomb," he said, shaking his head. He hated the deception the war had brought with it, and what that meant he had to do. His work made him feel as if he couldn't trust anyone anymore. Posters plastered the walls warning that you were being watched and telling you that you had to do your duty. And the previous night, his duty had been uppermost in his mind. He'd lied to the lad who saved him for a reason. He didn't work on the railways and didn't know the first thing about them. He was really a detective, recently seconded for some more dangerous jobs that went above and beyond his usual remit. It had taken him several months to get accepted into the group that he'd been charged with investigating, and on the very evening that he'd been invited up to the flat for the first time, good old Jerry had dropped a bomb on the place. It wasn't targeted, it couldn't have been. That would imply that someone had known who he was, and that all the other bombs that landed that night had been let off simply to hide the fact that the group had been infiltrated. No, it had to have been random. Just damn bad luck. The smoke had stopped drifting up from the remains of the buildings in the crater. All that was left was the rubble and the broken dreams. As for the investigation, there was no chance of finding any real evidence now without spending hours picking through the debris by himself. There was no manpower to help him. It probably didn't matter, and the effort would likely be disproportionate to the benefit. He knew for sure that he was the only person who had survived from the flat. He'd seen the bodies of the others, brought out during the morning. He'd made sure of that. He reckoned he'd been the only one saved because he'd gone to relieve his bladder at just the right time. The toilet had been at the front of the building. The sitting room had been at the back. And the sirens had started mere seconds before the bomb dropped, so he hadn't even had time to get out of the bathroom, let alone run outside to access the nearest shelter. At least he'd had time to do his trousers up. That had been his first thought when he realised he was alive. Funny the things that crossed your mind when you were under several feet of rubble. He would probably have died if it hadn't been for that Alfred chap. Strangely, that was what worried him. He found it unbelievable that he'd been found so quickly, considering how deeply he'd been buried. The more he thought about it, the more unbelievable it became, and he usually had good instincts about such things. He was good at his job. After visiting the doctor in the hall, he'd gone home, got a change of clothes, and come straight back. He hadn't seen Alfred at all during the day, which had just turned to night. Not that he had much to go on. The lower part of his face had been covered, no doubt ostensibly to keep out the dust. But could it have been for some other reason, maybe? A shock of blonde hair and piercing blue eyes was the sum total of a description. And he had the name. He'd already checked to see if that name was on any of the lists. Of course it wasn't. It was probably a false name pulled out of thin air. Something he'd seen on a gravestone or in the obituary columns. Damn the suspicion. Damn the conspiracy theories. Damn the war. The lad was probably as innocent as the next, but he couldn't let it rest until he was sure. Eddie coughed. The cigarette, a self-rolled masterpiece, was on the point of burning his lips. He threw it to the pavement and ground it hard with his boot. He shook his head in despair. All day and nothing to show for it. The pub on the next corner along beckoned. Not only for the alcohol to soothe his aches. A pint certainly wouldn't go amiss if they had anything in, which was unlikely. But there would also be people there only too willing to talk about what they'd seen the night before. People he'd befriended over recent months. If anyone knew who Alfred really was, it would be someone in there. Bones pushed back the manhole cover and scanned the area around him. There had been no more sirens and no more bombs. That was almost as unnerving as when they were pounding the city. There was no reason for him to go out other than that he'd got a taste for freedom from the previous night, and he couldn't sit still. He wanted to walk along the street and stretch his legs. He wanted to take good air into his lungs, as good as air ever was in the city. Just being outside was like a drug that he'd been deprived of for too long, and he wanted more. The complete dark, with no house lights showing, no lit street lamps, and no headlights on the few cars trundling along the streets, made it feel like a different world from the bustling metropolis of London that he and Rag had decided they really ought to experience for a few years, given they had so many to spare. When they'd moved there 3 years earlier, on a whim and the promise of the fun-filled nightlife and a readily available feast of blood there for the taking, things had been different. Their timing hadn't been the best. It had been great for a while. They'd frequented pubs and clubs, seen the latest releases in the West End, hobnobbed with the rich and famous. All for free, of course. And on the way home, they'd feasted as never before, always wiping the memories of their victims at the end of the meal. Now, the place had the air of a ghost town. It wasn't, of course. Much went on behind blacked-out windows and curtained doors, but it wasn't the same. There were disadvantages for him as well. For a start, there was no way he could use his super speed when it was so completely dark, because it was fraught with dangers. If he didn't notice an object blocking his path, then he might go flying and end up sprawled across the pavement. Or if it was something sharp, well, it didn't bear thinking about. Sight didn't always catch up with brain in time. Anyway, he didn't intend to stay out long, just enough to rid himself of the stench of the sewer. As he sauntered onto the high street, he hadn't expected to see a shrouded figure in a doorway across the other side of the street, watching. Watching him? Specifically? That was paranoia. He tried not to notice the figure. It was only a shadow, and shadows often didn't want to be seen. But he didn't think it was one of his kind. "Alfred?" At first, Bones didn't respond to the call, mainly because he wasn't used to hearing his real name. This was a good thing, because if he had, his cover would have been blown there and then. "Alfred!" The familiarity of the voice clawed at his recent memories. He didn't want it to be the man he had rescued. That was an unnecessary complication. But in his peripheral vision, he could see Eddie waving at him. He continued to walk on without responding. It wasn't rude. He was in character. Bones finally stopped in his tracks when Eddie limped across the road, waving his arms. He couldn't ignore the man if he was that intent on saying hello, but he had a very bad feeling about it. He could sense something in the man's demeanour that was hidden. Bones resisted trying to probe his mind. "Alfred," Eddie said again, and clapped a hand onto his shoulder. The smell of stale beer was on his breath, mingled with cigarette smoke. "Eddie." "Didn't you hear me calling?" "Calling? No," he said, tapping at his ear. "Ah, yes, I'd forgotten." Bones wished he'd put the scarf around his face again. Having his face completely exposed wasn't a wise move. "I thought you'd be at home recuperating." "I'm right as rain because of you. Not a scratch on me. Leg's a bit stiff, though. It'll pass, thanks to you." "We were lucky to find you." "I'm the one who was lucky. Let's walk, shall we?" Bones had no desire to walk along the street with this man, but it seemed he had little choice. Eddie was obviously lying about his health. He wasn't right as rain. He winced almost imperceptibly with every step, and Bones could hear the slight intake of breath when he put his foot down. There was no doubt that his left leg had been damaged, much more than a little stiffness. Bones didn't particularly want to advance the conversation himself, so he waited until Eddie said something. "That ARP chap, the one you were working with, he said you had something like an extra sense out there last night." And there it was. Now Bones knew the agenda. Eddie was suspicious, and, he guessed, not in a good way. "An extra sense? I'm not sure what you mean." Eddie stopped and turned towards him. "Well, he said that you were the one who found every single one of the casualties under the rubble last night. That's some record." Bones didn't think the warden had noticed. He was more observant than Bones had given him credit for. "No, you're wrong. There were lots of people clearing the site. Most of them had gone by the time we found you." "Come on now, lad, don't be bashful." An image of a dwarf with a long white beard and a pointy blue hat flashed across his mind. He said nothing. "So, how did you do it?" Eddie wasn't going to give up. It was beginning to feel as if he were in a police interrogation, or how Bones imagined that might be. All he'd wanted to do the night before was to help some of the injured people. That had clearly been a mistake. No, it hadn't. He didn't regret what he'd done. But he did need to find a way to extract himself from this situation, and not in a way that would draw attention. Bones smiled gently. "There's no secret, honest. I just started digging down, and I was lucky." Eddie's brow creased. Bones decided it was time to go on the offensive, and he was pretty sure he knew what would do it. "So, how was it on the railways today?" There was a noticeable pause before Eddie answered.
Oh, bit of disruption, you know, but it's pretty much like that every day.
That was a fudged answer. No specifics. Yes, I can imagine. Have many bombs landed on the tracks?
A few, here and there, you know.
Here and there. It would have been the talk of the workforce. Bones was sure of it. There was no way Eddie worked on the railways. But what did he do? Look, I just came out for a breath of fresh air. I need to be getting back.
Ah, the little lady waiting for you back at home.
Yes, something like that. He could play the non-specifics game too.
Maybe I can take you for a drink sometime to thank you.
That would be nice. Perhaps when all this is over. Bones waved his arms, non-specifically.
It's a date. I'll see you around then. Take care.
Yes, and you. Bones turned on his heels and walked back the way he'd come. He tried to measure his steps so that it didn't look like he was running, but he desperately wanted to run. He could feel Eddie's eyes on his back. The thought did flash across his mind that he should just kill Eddie. But what was the point of saving someone one day only to knock them down the next? It also went against all his instincts. He carried on. Bones knew it wouldn't be wise to simply turn down the alleyway and disappear into the manhole, in case Eddie was intent on following him. He walked a block further on and turned left down a side street. That was when he ramped up his speed and doubled back through a number of gardens and a pedestrian pathway. He stood for a good 5 minutes in the shadows, listening for any movement, the slightest whisper of sound, before he crept out into the alleyway and made his way to the manhole cover. He wouldn't be able to go out again. Not for a while. Eddie's hunches were legendary on the force. Some people got a prickle on the back of their neck when something was amiss. Others felt a cold shiver of air down their spine. Eddie felt it in the skin on the back of his hands. It was a tingling similar to when your hand had been stuck under your body overnight and had lost all feeling, and when it was released, the blood rushed in and the feeling returned. He got that sensation when he was around Alfred Crouch. Even though he was truly grateful for his rescue the previous night, he couldn't believe that this apparently unassuming man had managed to find all those people without some underhand methods coming into play. That was too much luck for any person. He wished he did believe in miracles, but he didn't. It was too good to be true. And things that were too good to be true were usually bad. Although what Alfred's ulterior motive for doing something like that would be, he couldn't fathom. And as for his method of detection, that was a complete mystery. He watched as Alfred walked beyond the alleyway he'd come out of earlier, and down a side street that was further along. But the alleyway called to him. Something told him that the dark and uninviting space was the clue that would help him solve the mystery of this man. And so he didn't follow him down the street. Instead, he waited in the alleyway, in a recessed doorway, where no moonlight fell upon him. Damn it, he needed a cigarette. The tension was getting to him. Turned out he didn't have all that long to wait. He heard the footsteps first. They weren't loud, deliberately so, he imagined, but a trained ear told him male rather than female. He waited until the figure came out into the open. He couldn't see his full form because of a sign hanging from one of the buildings, but he could see the bottom half. The figure was wearing the right type of boots, the right type of trousers. He held his breath. He expected Alfred to walk to one of the doors along the alleyway and enter a building, possibly with a secret knock, but he didn't. He stood in the centre of the narrow road for a moment, and then he bent down and, to Eddie's complete surprise, lifted a manhole cover and descended below the street. That sealed it. No one went down the sewers unless they didn't want to be seen. This was no longer a hunch. This was 100% an investigation. "What's wrong?" Rag said when his friend appeared, slightly out of breath and a little flushed. He hadn't been gone all that long, which was good, but his mood didn't seem to have improved. "Nothing," Bones said. That was a lie. Rag hadn't seen such a disgruntled face for some time. "Did you bring us anything to eat?" "Does it look like I did?" "No. Did you even try?" He hadn't been talking about their natural diet, warm, rich blood. There wasn't much chance of that, unless they happened upon someone unfortunate enough to have been caught by the bomb blasts, whose breathing had already stopped. But anything to fill up his stomach would have been good. A slab of cheese, a piece of bread. He'd even have eaten a raw cabbage, he was that hungry. A rumbling stomach down in the tunnels of the sewers was not something easily kept quiet. He exhaled a cold breath into equally cold air. "I thought you were going to come back invigorated, not with a weight on your shoulders." "Just shut up, will you?" Okay, something had happened. Something bad, Rag assumed. At the very least, something Bones hadn't expected. "If you talk about it, then maybe I can help." Bones raised his eyebrows above his hairline. "I could. I'm not a total waste of space." He wished he hadn't said that. It invited the kind of response that he really didn't want to hear. The bait wasn't taken, which surprised him, as did the words that actually came out of Bones' mouth. "I think we should move. You were right. We need a change of scenery." Rag swiped his hands together, rubbing off the imaginary dust. "Okay, now you're talking. I thought south of the river this time. I hear it's much nicer." "No, we're staying north." "What?" "I don't want to go miles. I just don't want to be down this hole. I have a bad feeling about it." Rag really wanted to move south. He had friends who'd gone that way, blood-sucking buddies, and he needed someone else to talk to once in a while. Living with Bones as his only companion for long periods wasn't a problem, but there were times when he craved to hear a different opinion, one that wasn't quite so biased towards humankind. "Please." Rag winced. It sounded like he was begging. "You go south if you want to. I'm not stopping you. I told you that before. We're not joined at the hip." Rag was so tempted. So very, very tempted. He might even have done it if they hadn't both heard the scrape of the manhole cover being lifted. Eddie peered into the hole. He could see there was a ladder, which was what he had expected, but little beyond that was visible. He didn't relish climbing into a totally dark space that ended in the sewer system under the London streets, after a man who could be waiting for him at the bottom, ready to do, well, he didn't know what. He reasoned with himself as he tried to pluck up the courage. A man climbing down into the sewers under cover of night wasn't a normal occurrence, and he could only think of one reason for it, that he belonged to some kind of clandestine organisation that was up to no good. During a war, clandestine organisations were not the kind of thing you wanted in a neighbourhood, unless they were yours, and this was most definitely not. He considered going back to the police station to report his findings and get backup, but that would involve a mountain of paperwork, and Alfred Crouch was unlikely to stick around. He thought about trying to get in touch with his contacts at the ministry. But that would take even longer. He couldn't let Crouch and his co-conspirators get away. What kind of detective would that make him? It was a risky operation, but he had to take that risk, and he had to do it right then. He pulled the torch out of his pocket and held it in his hand as he tentatively took his first few steps down the ladder. Only when he'd pulled the manhole cover back over his head did he switch the torch on. The beam of light didn't help much. The ladder seemed to disappear into a chasm. The light only cast its glow a few feet ahead of him. "You can do this," he said to himself, as quietly as his voice would allow. He took his time, trying so hard not to make a noise. The only way this was going to work was if he had the element of surprise. He attempted to take his mind off all the possible ways it could go wrong by logically thinking about what could be going on down there. It could be an operation to get German airmen back home, although he didn't suppose there were that many who came down in the London suburbs. It could be an operation to overthrow or infiltrate some government department. It could be an operation to blow up the sewers, causing even more chaos and misery for the inhabitants of the city. Of those three, he imagined infiltration would be the most likely. But infiltration for what purpose? Was it to take control? To assassinate key personnel? And what a place to meet up. It was dire. He thought about Alfred. He had spoken with no trace of a German accent. In fact, he had noticed a slight hint of a West Country lilt on one or two words. But it was possible that someone born in the West Country had German roots, and perfectly possible that they either didn't agree with the war, or their loyalties were with the other side. There were so many reasons why people did such things, and they didn't always seem rational to those around them. His foot hit solid ground beneath him. He took in a deep breath because of the effort, and gagged on the stench. He grabbed at a handkerchief that he always kept in his suit's jacket pocket and held it over his nose, and then he shone the torch along the seemingly infinite tunnel in front of him. "I don't understand," Bones whispered. "I took the long way round to get back down here. I know he didn't follow me. I waited to find out." Rag's mouth gaped. Had he zoned out when Bones was talking to him? He didn't remember anything about anyone following anyone else. "Well, you clearly didn't wait long enough. Who exactly is it who didn't follow you?" he said. His friend didn't answer. They had pinned their bodies into the dark crevices of the tunnel in the hopes that the man with the torch wouldn't notice their shadows in amongst the others cast by the network of tunnels. He seemed to be on his own, which was a rash decision. Whatever he thought was going on, coming down here alone was a huge risk. As the triangle of light began to move their way, it became obvious their hiding place would not suffice. It would be so much easier to kill the man, but Bones would never let Rag do the sensible thing. Rag looked at Bones. He nodded down the tunnel, away from the light. The disadvantage of running fast through a sewer was the wake that followed you. He remembered that all too well from when they were kids. Well, it wasn't the only disadvantage, but the others were probably better not thought about. A wake, of course, also showed your pursuer where you'd gone, and it wasn't like you could go too fast in such a concealed space. So the man followed, and they continued to run. Was he limping? Eddie was beginning to regret his decision to tackle the situation on his own. He had no idea of the mechanics of a sewer, other than waste travelled down the tunnels and ended up in a treatment plant somewhere, eventually. But as to the extent of the tunnels, and whether or not there were any dead ends that would be to his advantage in terms of capturing the suspects, that was a mystery. Suspects, plural. There seemed to only be 2 of them. That didn't mean that they were the only ones in this clandestine organisation. but they were the only ones meeting on this particular occasion. He was determined he wasn't going to let them get away, because then they'd be able to warn their accomplices, which would be much worse. If they moved to another location, he'd never find them again. No, there was no way he could let these two get away. He had to find out the truth. He'd never seen a proper interrogation, the kind that forced answers out of people. He'd done interviews, of course. Those were common practice. But an interrogation was much more serious. He wondered whether, once he'd secured them and turned them in, they might be subjected to some of the less palatable methods of obtaining information that he'd heard about. He had no idea whether his country would do such a thing, and it turned his stomach to even think about it. But this was war, and war changed what everyone was prepared to do. Whatever happened, he knew he wouldn't be involved. If he could prove these men were working against the war effort, they would be taken off somewhere else for that. He hoped he was right about this. Alfred Crouch had saved his life. "This one," Bones said, pointing to another shaft with a metal ladder reaching down towards them. "He's not that far behind," Rag said. "No, but we'd be faster if we're out of here." Bones leaped onto the ladder and pushed upwards. When Rag also placed his weight on the ladder, Bones could feel it move with the load. But he didn't slow down. He rammed the manhole cover with his hand and it gave easily. He lifted it and scoped out where they were. Another road, but this one was far more open and exposed. They didn't have a choice about whether they went outside. That had been made for them, but this wasn't ideal. He slid the cover away and lifted his head a little higher. He looked down at Rag. "We need to do this quickly. There are people around." Rag nodded. There was only so fast you could go when you had to lift yourself out of a hole and replace a cover, but they sped away so fast that he hoped those around would think they'd imagined it. Luckily, there was little in the way of obstacles that might hinder them. They vaulted the iron railings of a park that had been closed for the night and landed in amongst a row of trees and bushes. It was a good vantage point. They could still see the manhole cover they'd escaped from, some 100 feet down the road. They hunkered down and waited. It was another 5 minutes before Eddie's head appeared above ground. It was obvious he found it a struggle to get himself out. "What does he want with us?" Rag said. "I don't know. I saved his life. He's already thanked me." "Well, he clearly thinks you're up to no good now." "You think?" He hated it when Rag stated the obvious. Bones couldn't make any sense of it. The man had seemed so happy to be saved the night before. Now he was doing his level best to make an enemy of them. What was it that had tipped the scales against him? Surely it couldn't just be his supposed extra sense. "Do you think he knows about us? You know," Rag said, exposing his fangs. "What? That we're vampires? I think that's unlikely. And put those away." Rag hissed. He stood and began to trample down a circle in the grass. "Get down!" "No." Rag clicked his fingers. "He thinks we're spies. It has to be. What did you say to him? Did you tell him anything about us?" "No, nothing at all." Rag crouched again. "I knew it was wrong to stay in the city. We're too conspicuous. At our age, we should have been off fighting." "I told them I couldn't hear properly." "Well, that worked well, didn't it?" Bones didn't let on that he thought Rag was right. They were too conspicuous. Going out had only drawn attention. "We should get right away from here. Maybe." the distant drone of sirens began to ring out across the city again. Oh, hell. We need to be under cover.
We can't go back down that way.
Well, we can't stay here. Our powers aren't any protection against bombs.
Rag snorted. Wouldn't that be cool? We can't go to one of the shelters either. With our luck, we'd pick the same one he went to, and I'm not sure we smell all that savoury at the moment. We'd be obvious. We'd be sitting ducks. Look, we can outrun a bomb if we need to. If we stay where we are and take it minute by minute, we should be all right.
Or not. Bones pointed across to the road. Eddie was walking directly towards them.
That's ridiculous. He's not one of us. How did he see us?
I don't know. Bones resisted mentioning that Rag had stood up. Maybe he didn't. He might just think this is a good place to hide.
Shut up. Did you hear that?
Bones stood up. They remained motionless for a few seconds, taking in everything they could with their heightened hearing. In the background was the grating hum of a German bomber flying overhead, but more disturbing was the slight whistle of something moving fast through the air. All sorts of calculations went through Bones' head as he listened, calculations that brought him to only one conclusion. The bomb was coming down directly on top of where they were. He heard the grunt of Eddie making a complete mess of climbing over the railings with his injured leg, and turned towards him.
"No, you idiot! What are you doing?"
Bones whispered. It was a split-second decision. He knew that if he did nothing, Eddie would definitely die this time, and he couldn't have that on his conscience. It was his fault the man was climbing over the railings. There was nothing else for it. Bones sped towards Eddie and wrapped his arm around his waist. He lifted his feet from the ground and ran for their lives, back towards where Rag was standing.
"You really?"
Rag said, as Bones passed him.
"Hey, wait for me!"
They'd left it too late to get right away from where the bomb landed. It had obviously missed its preferred target, because it had come to rest in the middle of the park, where only 3 figures had been located, and not one important building. They were thrown into the air by the force of the blast, but not directly hit, and their bodies smashed against a line of trees before painfully coming to rest. All of them were injured, but none mortally. Bones hauled himself to his feet. His head was thumping. Head first was not his favourite way to land. His neck wasn't broken, but it was mightily sore. If he had broken it, he wouldn't have been able to move for several hours without help. His legs had also been battered. That was the impact of Eddie's body on his. Bones hadn't been able to hold on when the bomb exploded. He was strong, but there were limits. The fact that he'd been beneath Eddie when he landed had probably saved the man's life, although Eddie wasn't conscious, and his arm was definitely bent the wrong way. Rag lay a little further away from the two of them. He groaned like a dead creature coming back to life, but he was moving. He could take care of himself. Bones put his hand against Eddie's cheek. He wasn't sure why he did it. It wasn't like he had any idea what temperature a human body was supposed to be. But Eddie was breathing, and there was no blood, apart from the trace from a few scratches on his hand. "Come on," Rag said, now standing and rolling his head from side to side as his neck clicked back into alignment. "We need to get out of here before anyone else comes to see what happened." There was already some movement over by the road, but they were well hidden where they'd landed and could afford a couple of minutes more before they disappeared. Bones had made another decision. "We can't leave him here like this."
"Why ever not? He wasn't exactly being friendly to us half an hour ago."
No, he wasn't. Rag picked up something from the ground beside where Eddie lay. He held it up while clearing his throat. Bones stared at it, a badge. Eddie was in the police. It was the worst possible thing that Eddie could be if they wanted to keep their lives a secret, but that didn't make his life any less worth the effort. He knew that would be a hard sell to Rag. "Look," Bones said, "if you were a detective, you'd think that someone climbing down a manhole cover in the middle of the night was suspicious. He was only doing his job." Rag bent down towards him, slapping his thighs in the process. "He is a danger to us. A thumping great danger. You need to get rid of him. No one will know how he died. They'll think it was the bomb. It's not as if they're going to go over his body with a fine-tooth comb, is it? Get rid of him now, and we won't have a problem in the future." "No." Bones carefully lifted Eddie's body. He knew that if he left him where he was, he might not get found for a long time. It might be too late. He carried Eddie to the front of the crater and gently laid him down on the ground again. Rag sighed. "One of these days you're going to get us killed. And one of these days you're going to learn that we can't live without mortals." "Pah!" In the blink of an eye they were gone, just as the small group of people who'd ventured out after the blast pushed through the park gates to survey the damage. Eddie kept his eyes tightly closed until he was sure they'd gone. He wasn't overly scared, but self-preservation was his highest priority at that moment. He was the only one who knew what had happened. He needed to find out more. He still didn't have a proper description of the second man, which irked him a little because he knew he could be out of action for a while. He couldn't even feel his arm. "Please let it be all right," he prayed. He wasn't religious, but at that point he needed to believe in something. He'd seen a lot of things that night that had disturbed him, not least that two men who'd been thrown hard against the trees could get up and walk around straight away, with little more than a scratch between them. The first person to reach him was the ARP warden from the night before. The warden looked at him in disbelief. "Blimey, you're either the unluckiest man in the whole of London, or the luckiest. Can't make up my mind. What the heck were you doing in here? The gates were locked." "Just doing my job, George," Eddie said. "So, you swapped from railway man to midnight gardener, did you?" Eddie laughed. In a way, he had been trying to get rid of the weeds. "No, I am actually police. Look, could you come down the station later on? I'd like you to give a description of someone for our records." "Police, eh? All right, but mate, I think we need to get you sorted before we think about that kind of thing. Come on, do you think you can stand?" "Yes, sure, with a little help." Eddie leaned on the warden and pulled himself up with his good arm. He looked back to where he knew the two men had been, but there was nothing to show that they'd ever been there at all. If it wasn't for the trail of watery footprints leading to the park railings, he might have believed that he'd dreamt it all. Bones and Rag found refuge in an old warehouse that had been bombed out some time before, but there was still one room standing at the back of the building. It wasn't the kind of place anyone else would enter for fear of the rest of it collapsing, but it was a perfect place to recuperate from their injuries. Rag was in a foul mood, demonstrated by his fisted right hand thumping into the palm of his left, imitating the rhythm of a metronome. That, and the words that spewed out of his mouth. "This only happened because of you," he shouted at Bones. "We should have been safely tucked away when that bomb hit, not out in the open air. I still don't know why you did it. You didn't have to stay there the other day and help all those people. You brought attention to us, and you're the one who's always saying we need to hide in the shadows. You're breaking your own rules so many times it's like—" It's like... Shut up. No, I won't. I'm sick of it. Bones had listened to enough criticism. Right or wrong, he was on his feet in an instant. His fingers wrapped around Rag's neck, pushing him up against the broken plaster of the wall. Disturbed dust fell down onto Rag's face, causing him to spit and writhe. I helped people. If I hadn't done that, many more people would be dead. Eddie, for one. They'd have given up looking, he was so well hidden. Rag spoke through gritted teeth. And look what good that did us. I don't care about that. He doesn't understand what we are, and why should he? It's not like we're front-page news. Well, we can't stay around here now. He's going to be looking for us, any chance he gets. Bones stared up at the patchwork ceiling. I've changed my mind. I'm staying. What? You go if you want, but I can't leave these people. They need me. Eddie stared at the piece of paper sitting on the desk in front of him. He had the physical description he wanted from the warden, which matched his own. He'd been hoping for a bit more detail, but even though the man had spent a significantly greater amount of time with Alfred Crouch, his focus had been more on the rescue than anything else. What he really needed was an artist's impression so that he could show it to other people. That kind of thing was much more effective when you were looking for a suspect. But there were no artists at the station, and he didn't know anyone else who could help him out at short notice. He was going to have to make do with what he had, which was height, approximately 6'2", hair, blonde, length shoulder, eyes blue, age early 20s, stature medium, identifying marks, etc., claims hard of hearing. He had considered putting some other things on that list, such as incredible speed and superhuman strength, possibly even extra-sensitive sense of hearing or smell, because that was presumably how he'd found all the victims after that first bomb blast. But no one was going to take those things seriously, or him if he suggested them. He decided that the next morning he would start a door-to-door at the shops that were open on the high street, and if that failed to unearth anything, he'd go on to the houses and flats in the neighbourhood. Eddie stood up and tried to stretch. He wanted to lift his left arm high up into the air as well, but that proved to be impossible. "Damn plaster," he muttered. The elderly secretary, who was sitting a couple of desks along from him, gave him one of those withering looks that she used to keep the lads in check. He mouthed an insincere, "Sorry." The plaster, or rather the broken arm, which had been severely dislocated by the blast, was the last thing he needed to add to his limp and the numerous bruises on pretty much all of his body. It wasn't going to make his work easier. Another night, another bomb. Bones listened to the thud of explosions gradually getting closer. He hadn't seen Rag since it got dark. He'd headed off, no doubt to find the utopia he imagined was waiting for him south of the river. Sitting there alone, Bones felt like he'd lost a limb. He'd been separated from Rag before, many times, but it was always a wrench. He'd consider not going back to his usual spot underground, but at least he knew that part of the sewer system. If he went somewhere else, he might not be able to get out in an emergency, and there was no sign of Eddie or anyone else. But no matter how much he tried, when he heard the bombers approaching, he couldn't bear the thought of sitting idle underground, and, in the process, letting countless people suffer unnecessarily. He might not still be immortal, but he had been once. He could remember what it felt like to be scared, although he'd never experienced the horrors of war firsthand. He'd spent the last one cocooned in a remote spot on the Scottish Isles, and he certainly knew what it was like to feel helpless and alone. As the bombs dropped once again, the aroma of acrid smoke seeped underground. As before, he could hear people rushing around, screaming and crying. He tied his scarf around his face and made his way out onto the street. This time the closest bomb had hit ground much further to the left of where he was. It looked like it was a couple of streets away. He took a cursory glance around to see if there was any sign of Eddie. He wasn't expecting to see him. He'd been quite badly injured, but he didn't want to walk straight into the man. That could only end badly. He saw no sign of him. Bones ran to the site of the bomb, once again trying desperately to regulate his speed so that he didn't draw attention. When he got there, the rescue was well underway. It was a different ARP warden who was managing the exodus of people this time, and now homeless, to a church hall just around the corner. There were many walking wounded. He tried to think back to what had been where now there was only a crater, and then it came to him. The old cinema. The place could have been packed out at this time of night, because so many people tried to go about their normal activities, determined not to let the other side get the better of them. They were probably watching something to try to raise their spirits. There were already enough people dealing with the casualties on the site. His presence would only complicate things. But Bones did hear a cry just away from the main area. It was only faint, hidden by the sounds of dealing with war, but he could clearly hear a woman's voice begging for help. He tried desperately to focus his hearing in on where the sound was coming from. It was behind where he stood, a few feet further back. He followed the trace of the sound until he found her. But by the time he got there, even though it was only seconds, she had stopped calling out, and he could see why. She was one of the walking wounded from the explosion. She had a large blood stain on her clothing around the area of her waist, and her hand was clasped to the site, although it was no longer applying any pressure. Had she been trying to walk home? She had lost too much blood. He knelt down beside her and listened to her breathing. He couldn't even feel the faintest breath against his skin. He was too late. Unless... As far as he could tell in the chaos, there was no one else close enough to see what he was about to do. He bit into his wrist hard enough for the blood to flow, and held the dripping wound to her mouth. Globules of his rich blood trickled into her mouth, but not quickly enough. She was going to die if he didn't take more drastic action. He pulled at her blouse, ripping it so that he could get to the wound, and placed his wrist directly where her skin had been torn apart. As his blood spread across the wound, the skin and everything beneath slowly began to heal. Soon after, her body jolted to life, and she took in a gulp of air. "I've got you now," said a familiar voice from behind him. Bones looked down at the woman. She was still incredibly pale, but she was breathing. He knew what it must look like. He'd ripped a woman's clothes to expose her bare skin. The wound was no longer apparent, although the blood was still on her clothes. There was only one way he was going to get out of this situation. He didn't like to admit it, but Rag had been right. Eddie had seen everything. To start with, he hadn't believed that Alfred had dared to show up again, but someone he'd given the description to earlier in the day had noticed him walking along the street, even in all the confusion, and pointed him out. It was probably the fact that there weren't many young men around that had worked in Eddie's favour. When you saw one, they stood out like a beacon. He'd expected Alfred would get stuck in at the bomb site, like he had only a couple of days earlier when Eddie's own life had been saved. But he didn't. He walked straight to where the woman lay on the ground, badly wounded, perhaps even mortally wounded. It was like he knew she was there. It was uncanny. Eddie no longer believed it was coincidence. He'd watched, hardly daring to breathe, as Alfred had put his wrist to the woman's mouth. From where he was standing, he couldn't see exactly what was happening, but he was determined not to interfere. And then Alfred had ripped her clothes. It had taken all his reserves not to step forward and strike the man. But the wound, once revealed, was horrendous. It was the type of wound that people rarely survived without immediate medical intervention. But something magical had happened. Alfred had put his wrist to the wound and dripped his own blood upon it. And before Eddie's very eyes, the wound began to reduce in size until there was nothing left of it. Tears had welled up in his eyes, even though he'd tried to beat them down. He had been right. Alfred had deliberately moved him to where he would easily be found the previous night. He hadn't wanted him to be left lying in the trees where he might not be seen for hours. He didn't completely understand what was going on, and the existence of magic of any sort was not something he believed in. But he knew that this man, whatever he was not bad. "Well done, lad," Eddie said. His words sounded genuine enough, although the "I've got you now" opener had put Bones on his guard. He let his body relax and his teeth retract before speaking. "Eddie," he turned around to face the man, "this is becoming a habit." "She looks a lot better now," Eddie said, pointing to the woman. Bones looked into the man's thoughts. He had to know how much Eddie had seen. There was no avoiding it. It was more than he'd expected. The truth left him in a state of indecision. Let him remember, or not. He decided to let things pan out, at least for a few minutes. "She's still very weak. She'll need help to get home." "She will. Look, I don't know what it was you did just there, or how you found me in the rubble the other night, and I don't want to know. But I want you to know that I won't be chasing you anymore." "I'm not a spy." "I know that now, lad. I don't know what you are, but as far as I'm concerned, you can carry on what you're doing, just as you have been. But I'd suggest you be a little more careful about who sees what." Bones allowed all the remaining tension in his body to dissipate. "You're sure?" "Look, lad, I've never been one to believe in ghosts and creatures of the dark, but I do know that there are many things that I don't understand. Let's just say I accept that you exist, in the same way that I know gravity will keep my feet on the ground." Bones stood up. Eddie raised his hand. They held on to each other for long seconds. "Thank you," Bones said. "There aren't many who would say that. I do want to help. I know what I can do is only a drop in the ocean." "It's not a drop in the ocean. Every single person who's saved is important. Now, let's get this lass home before she gets a chill. Give me her bag and I'll see if I can find her address." Bones handed him the battered handbag. Eddie winced as he took it. He had a large plaster immobilizing his other arm. "You broke it?" Bones said. A plaster like that wasn't going to help Eddie do his job. "Yes, dislocated and broken in one. 6 weeks, they say, in this blasted plaster." "I could—" Eddie cut him off straight away before he could even make the offer. "No, lad. Much as I appreciate the thought, I think I'll let nature take its course. No offence intended." "No offence taken," Bones said. The end.